They said the gods were eternal. They said the heavens were fixed, that power had been decided, that the war for the sky had already been won. They said Zeus sat at the top of everything, and nothing could reach him there. They were wrong. Because somewhere across an ocean that the Greeks never mapped, in a world their myths never touched, there was a god who had never heard of Zeus, and who would not have cared if he had. A god who carried lightning not as a symbol, not as a warning, but as a weapon he had earned through blood, through fire, and through a kind of rage that makes Olympus look like a palace of spoiled children arguing over golden thrones. His name was Shango. And when you place him next to Zeus, truly place them side by side, power against power, myth against myth, something uncomfortable happens, something the Greeks never prepared you for. The question stops being whether Zeus is the strongest god in his world. The question becomes whether his world is even the most dangerous one. Stay with this, because what you're about to discover is not a simple comparison. It is a collision, and collisions always leave something broken. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know. Zeus, the Olympian, the Sky Father, the god who dethroned his own father, who split the cosmos with his brothers, who looked at chaos and said, "I will rule this." He commands thunder. He commands fate, at least partially. He has crushed titans, imprisoned giants, humbled gods who dared to challenge him. The Greeks built an entire civilization around the idea that Zeus was the ceiling, the absolute upper limit of divine authority. Even the other gods feared him. Even Hera, his own wife, moved carefully around his power. But here is what gets buried in the glory. Zeus inherited his throne through war. He did not create the cosmos. He conquered a version of it that already existed. The sky was not his original home. It was his prize after defeating Kronos, after a war so devastating it shook the foundations of existence itself. And even after that victory, even sitting on his golden throne, Zeus was never truly safe. The myths make that clear if you read them carefully enough. There were prophecies whispered about a child who would surpass him. There were moments, Typhon, the giants, the rebellion of the gods, when the whole structure threatened to come apart. Zeus survived all of it, but survival is not the same as invulnerability, and that distinction matters enormously when Shango enters the story. Because Shango did not inherit anything. Shango built his power out of catastrophe. He is the Orisha of thunder, lightning, and justice in the Yoruba tradition, one of the most ancient and intricate mythological systems in the world, born in the lands of West Africa, carried in the blood of entire civilizations for thousands of years before a single Greek temple was ever erected. The Yoruba did not create Shango as a symbol of power. They created him, or perhaps discovered him, as a force, a being of almost unendurable intensity. And here is where it starts to get dangerous. Shango was not born into divinity the way Zeus was. According to the most powerful traditions, Shango was a king first, a human king, a ruler of Oyo who was so extraordinary, so terrifyingly gifted, that the boundary between mortal and divine simply could not hold him. He broke through it. He became something that should not exist, a man who became a god not through birth but through will and fire and refusal to be ordinary. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what kind of being emerges from that kind of origin. Zeus became powerful through divine inheritance and war. Shango became powerful through becoming something entirely new. One of them grew into power, the other exploded into it. And that is only where the story begins. The Yoruba tradition describes Shango with a detail that should stop you cold. He breathes fire, not figuratively, not as metaphor. When the anger rises in Shango, when justice has been denied, when the innocent have been crushed, when the wicked have grown too comfortable, he opens his mouth and fire comes out. This is a god whose rage is physically present in the world. You don't just feel his wrath, you see it, you burn inside it. He wears a double-headed axe, the Osh, that doesn't just split wood or bone, but splits the sky itself when it falls. His colors are red and white, colors the Yoruba chose with intention, red for the blood and fury, white for the purity and justice underneath. Because this is the part about Shango that most people miss when they hear God of Thunder and assume he is simply a storm deity. He is not just power, he is justice wrapped in power. He does not destroy randomly. He destroys correctly, and somehow that makes him more terrifying, not less, because you cannot bribe him, you cannot negotiate with him, you cannot hide behind status or divine bloodline and expect mercy. When Shango comes, it is because something has gone wrong that cannot be allowed to stand. Zeus, by contrast, had a complicated relationship with justice. He represented it, he was the god of law and order, and the Greeks prayed to him for it, but his own behavior was a different story. His myths are saturated with moments of ego, vengeance, and desire overriding principle. He punished Prometheus not purely for justice, but because the act of giving fire to humans felt like a challenge to divine authority. He punished humans for things that, by any honest measure, were not their fault. He pursued and transformed and destroyed with a kind of capricious anger that his worshippers explained away as divine prerogative. Zeus was mighty, but Zeus was not always just. Shango was both, and the combination, that is what makes the comparison begin to crack open into something profound. But we haven't reached the twist yet. We haven't reached the part of Shango's story that changes everything. Keep going, because what happened to Shango, what he survived, what it cost him, is the part that makes his power mean something entirely different from anything in the Greek tradition. There came a moment in Shango's story, and the Yoruba accounts of this are devastating in their honesty, when he lost everything. He was still a king, still human or barely more than human, still walking the earth with his 3 wives, Oya, Oshun, and Oba, still commanding Oya, still expanding his influence, still reaching towards something that his mortal form could barely contain. And then came the catastrophe. The details vary across the traditions, but the core is consistent and brutal. Shango, in a moment of extraordinary and uncontrolled power, accidentally destroyed his own palace, his own children. His own people, the lightning that would one day make him a god, first turned against everything he loved. He was not attacked by an enemy. He was not betrayed by a rival. The disaster came from inside him, from the power he had been cultivating, the power he thought he could control, the power that turned out to be larger than his ability to hold it safely. He fled, the great Shango, the warrior king, the one who would become the god of lightning. He ran into the forest, alone, broken, and there, by most accounts, he died. Now stop, feel the weight of that, because this is not how Zeus's story goes. Zeus never faced genuine self-destruction. Zeus never lost everything to his own power. Zeus had moments of challenge, yes, but his mythological arc is fundamentally triumphant, fundamentally linear. He wins, he consolidates, he rules. His suffering, when it appears, comes from outside, from titans, from giants, from the machinations of other gods. He is never undone by himself. Shango was, and then, and this is the turn, this is where the story breaks apart and rebuilds itself into something extraordinary. He came back. Not as a king, not as a man, not as someone who survived a setback and returned to power. He came back as something else entirely. The Yoruba tradition does not describe this as a resurrection in the peaceful sense. It describes it as a transformation through destruction. Shango descended into the earth and rose from it as an Orisha, a divine force, eternal, elemental, answering now not to the politics of Oyo, but to the deepest structure of reality itself. The very catastrophe that should have ended him became the forge that completed him. The fire that destroyed his palace was the same fire that burned away everything in him that was still merely human. Zeus was never tested like that. Zeus never had to survive being destroyed by his own nature. And there is an argument, a serious, mythologically grounded argument, that what emerges from that kind of trial is a different category of power altogether, not stronger necessarily in terms of raw force, but deeper, more absolute, the kind of power that cannot be taken because it was never given, the kind of power that has already survived its own destruction and therefore has nothing left to fear. Now we have to talk about Oya, because you cannot talk about Shango honestly without talking about Oya, and the moment you bring Oya into this, the stakes expand in a way that pulls the entire comparison with Zeus into new territory. Oya is Shango's primary wife. She is the Orisha of storms, of wind, of the Niger River, of transformation and death. She commands the hurricane. She walks at the border between the living and the dead, and she does not flinch. In the traditions, Oya fights alongside Shango, not as support, not as companion, but as equal combatant, as a warrior in her own right, whose power in battle some accounts describe as surpassing even Shango's. She carries his lightning when he needs her to. She charges into the places where even divine soldiers hesitate. She is, in every meaningful sense, a goddess of war and death who chose Shango, and that choice tells you something about what Shango is. Because gods attract what they are. Power draws power. And if the being who governs death and storm and transformation looked at all the divine and mortal options available to her and said that one, then Shango must contain something that even a goddess of that magnitude found irreplaceable. Zeus had Hera. Hera is formidable, she is powerful, she is vengeful, she is the queen of Olympus and not to be taken lightly. But Hera's strength in the myths is largely reactive. She responds to Zeus's behavior. She schemes around him, against him, because of him. She is defined in relation to him. Oya is not defined in relation to Shango. She has her own domain, her own mythology, her own terrifying power. She stands beside him as an independent force. And when they fight together, when the thunder and the hurricane move as one, the Yoruba tradition describes it as the kind of storm that reshapes the earth. There is something in that image that Zeus's mythology never quite reaches. Zeus is surrounded by gods who defer to him, who fear him, who obey him. His power is demonstrated through dominance. Shango's power is demonstrated through alliance with something that doesn't need to be dominated, because it already contains its own kind of catastrophe. And now we need to go deeper, because there is a question that has been building underneath everything said so far, a question that the Yoruba tradition answers in a way that Greek mythology simply does not have an equivalent for. What is Shango exactly? In Greek terms, this seems like a simple question. Zeus is a god. He has a nature, a domain, a genealogy. He sits within a cosmic structure that the Greeks mapped with great precision. Zeus is inside the system. He is the king of it, but he is still a part of it, still subject to it in ways the myths occasionally reveal, subject to the fates, subject to prophecy, subject to the deeper laws that even the Olympians cannot fully override. Shango, as an Orisha, occupies a different kind of position. The Orishas in Yoruba theology are not simply gods in the Greek sense. They are aspects of Olodumare, the supreme divine reality, the source behind all creation, that have taken on specific identities and domains in order to interact with the living world. They are not separate from the divine source. They are expressions of it. And Shango, specifically, is the expression of divine power manifesting as justice, as thunder, as the corrective force that reality itself deploys when the balance has been broken too severely. That is not the same thing as a god who commands lightning. That is something closer to lightning being a language, and Shango being the one who speaks it on behalf of everything that exists. Zeus commands, Shango embodies, and in the deepest terms of mythological power, embodiment goes further than command. You can lose command, you can have it taken, challenged, usurped, as Zeus himself feared with the prophecy about his children. Embodiment cannot be taken. It is not a position, it is a nature. This is where the comparison stops being about who would win in a fight, because that question, while dramatically satisfying, misses the more important thing and starts being about what kind of power each figure represents at its core. Zeus represents the power of authority, of hierarchy, of a being who stood above all others and made himself the center of the cosmic order. That is real power. It is not small. But Shango represents something that functions outside of hierarchy, a force that exists not because it was appointed, but because it is necessary, because reality requires it, because without the thunder that corrects and destroys and clears the path, existence itself collapses into stagnation and injustice. And here is the question that should unsettle you. If Shango is necessary to the structure of existence, what happens when Zeus acts unjustly? What happens when the king of Olympus, sitting on his golden throne, makes a decision that tips the balance the wrong way? Who corrects him? The Greek myths have an answer to this, and it is uncomfortable. Essentially, no one. The fates operate above Zeus in some ways, and there are moments in the myths where even Zeus bows to what has been decreed. But there is no corrective force in Greek mythology that actively hunts injustice the way Shango does. There is no Olympian equivalent of a god who was destroyed by his own excess and came back as pure justice. The Greek system assumes that the powerful are the just, or at least it builds its structures around them as if they were. When Zeus is unjust, the myths tend to frame it as divine prerogative rather than cosmic failure. The Yoruba system does not make that assumption. The Yoruba system built Shango into the structure specifically because power without correction is catastrophe. They knew this. They had seen it in Shango's own story, the king who burned his own palace, who could not contain himself, who had to be destroyed and rebuilt into something that could bear the weight of what he was. Shango's myth is not a story of triumph. It is a story of accountability, of a force so powerful that it could not exist in raw form and had to be refined through loss before it could be trusted with eternity. Zeus was never refined that way. Zeus won and then he ruled, and something in that difference, that absence of the crucible, that lack of the catastrophic self-reckoning, leaves a gap at the center of his power that Shango's story does not have. This is not an argument that Shango would defeat Zeus in some impossible divine confrontation. The traditions do not intersect that way, and forcing them to would flatten both into something lesser than what they are. This is an argument about what each figure means, about what the civilizations that created them understood about power, justice, and what it costs to hold them together. The Greeks understood power as hierarchy. The Yoruba understood power as responsibility. And the god that emerges from responsibility, that was built by catastrophe into an instrument of cosmic correction, is operating in a dimension of meaning that pure hierarchy cannot reach. There is one more thing, one more layer that hasn't been opened yet, and it is the one that makes this entire comparison haunt you after it's over. Shango is still worshipped, not in the historical sense, not in the careful academic reverence that the West extends to Greek mythology, but actively by living communities in real ceremonies with real devotion in West Africa and across the diaspora that was forced across the ocean and refused to let him die. The Yoruba tradition survived the worst thing human beings have ever done to each other, carried in the memories and the prayers and the songs of people who were stripped of everything else and still held onto Shango, still called on the thunder, still built the fires, still remembered the double axe and the red and white and the king who burned and came back. Zeus did not survive that way. Zeus is myth now, beautiful, powerful, endlessly fascinating myth, but myth that functions as story rather than as living force. The temples are empty, the sacrifices have stopped, the civilization that created him is gone, and Zeus went with it into the archive of human imagination, preserved but no longer called upon. Shango is still being called upon. And in the end, that might be the most profound answer to the question this started with. Is there a god stronger than Zeus? By what measure? By raw mythological power? The answer is genuinely complicated, genuinely worth the argument. But by the measure of survival, by the measure of what endures, of what people hold on to when everything else has been taken, the answer tilts in a direction that the Greeks might have found genuinely surprising. The god who was destroyed and rebuilt, the god who survived through the people who carried him, the god of thunder who had already learned, through the worst experience possible, that power without accountability eventually burns down everything it loves. That god did not just survive. That god never stopped speaking. And somewhere right now, if the sky is dark enough and the storm is real enough, someone is listening.